So thank you very much for attending this webinar and welcome to the Urban Security Briefings. This is a briefing on gangs and militias during COVID-19 pandemic. The webinar format allows us to reach people outside of the traditional London audience that usually attends our events, so welcome. And for those of us who don't know, urban security, including the study of armed conflict and non-state armed groups, is one of the main research streams at the IISS Conflict, Security and Development Program. This new event series aims to bring some of the best minds to discuss these issues on a regular basis. So keep track of our events and output. And this is an opportune moment to discuss armed groups in cities, as they have often been on international headlines as cities and their populations adapt to the momentous changes brought about by the pandemic and the quarantine measures. And the prominence they have had, these non-state armed groups have had in some urban areas, such as the favelas of Rio or the low-income areas of Cape Town, reflects the type of order or governance that they implement to some extent in many urban areas, particularly in the developing world. And this political impact of armed groups over urban territories is precisely what we aim to discuss today. So I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Dennis Rodgers, who is a research professor at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies, International and Development Studies in Geneva. He has conducted extensive work on the issue of gangs and is currently doing that in Nicaragua, South Africa, and France. And Kieran Mitton is a senior lecturer in international relations at King's College London, and he also serves as research director for the Conflict, Security and Development Research Group. Kieran founded the Urban Violence Research Network, of which I'm a happy member, and it's a very interesting initiative for those of you interested in this topic. So after the initial remarks and discussions, you, our attendees, can ask questions that can be done through the Q&A button that is on the bottom of the screen, or by raising your hand, as you can see there, next to your name on the participants pane on the right side of the screen. And I will try to do a round of questions in which I will give literally voice to some of you to ask the questions. So then if I may start with you, we are discussing, and I think this topic has gained a lot of traction in academic and policy circles, the issue of governance, gang governance. To what extent, what is the extent to which gangs actually provide governance in territories, in your experience, and how is that impacting, you know, the current situation with the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Antonio, and thank you for this invitation to this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here, or rather to be here virtually, should one say. I think in some ways the starting point here when you're thinking about gang governance is that if we think about gangs and other related armed groups, they're generally seen as kind of embodiment of disorder, of violence, and kind of anarchic destruction. And this, whether in policy-making circles, among law enforcement officials, or the general public at large. But certainly within academia, there's a long-standing tradition of research which highlights how these kinds of organizations can also be institutional vectors for the imposition and the promotion of particular forms of generally local social structuration. In the course of my research, for example, which started in the 1990s in Nicaragua, I focused on the gangs which emerged in the post-conflict context as mediums for the organization of local collective life in many of the slums and poor neighborhoods of the country's cities. They displayed a vigilante ethos. They sought to protect local communities. They engaged in activities that aimed at mitigating insecurity and unpredictability. They'd patrol neighborhoods, for example. They would provide bodyguard services. They would engage in forms of ritualized warfare, which, although often very destructive, at the same time followed very prescribed scripts. They were very ritualized and therefore provided local inhabitants with a kind of early warning system, which in a broader context of post-conflict strife and economic discombobulation kind of provided a real sense of predictability and security. Now, in my writings, I've talked about these kinds of patterns of behavior through the conceptual trope of gang governance. Now, governance is generally associated with notions of technical efficiency, but at its most basic, you could say that governance relates to the act of governing. So in the imposition of a sense of order and regularity onto a given social reality, context, and process. Now, governance is obviously generally associated with the states and their particular modes of action or regimes, but there's no reason why other institutions cannot play the same role, including gangs and other non-state armed groups. Now, the reasons why forms of gang governance emerge can vary. It can be perhaps because the state's reach is weak or non-existent, for example, or it can be because the state has explicitly outsourced its authority in areas that are less of interest to those who control the state, such as slums and poor urban neighborhoods. Generally, elite states controlled by elites don't really care about the poor, except insofar as they can perhaps exploit them for labor purposes. Now, when you think about it in this very broad way, it's perhaps not surprising that gangs and other criminalized groups, such as mafias, militias, or drug cartels, have been reported as being at the forefront of local responses to the current global pandemic. Drug trafficking gangs in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil have, for example, helped impose lockdown curfews in the city's poor favelas. And their justification for this has actually been, we are imposing a curfew because nobody is taking this pandemic seriously. And it's something that's actually been welcomed in the face of the Bolsonaro government's disastrous response to the crisis. The mafia in southern Italy, for example, have offered low interest and sometimes no interest loans to poor families in order to be able to tide them over in the face of enforced unemployment due to lockdown. Well, in Mexico, drug cartels have organized the extensive distribution of food parcels to families which are finding themselves in the face of kind of economic difficulty and unable to kind of provide food security for themselves. Now, all this seems well and good. You know, it's a nice story. It's kind of, it's almost, you know, heartens the cockle shells of the heart, so to speak. We are these kind of organizations which we think are terrible, nasty organizations that seem to be doing good. But one of the institutional hallmarks of gangs and other related organizations is their volatility. Nicaraguan gangs, for example, changed radically between the 90s when they were protecting local neighborhoods to the 2000s when they became heavily involved in drug trafficking. Gangs became involved as a security apparatus of drug trafficking, and it led to their becoming vectors for the imposition of localized regimes of terror based on acts of arbitrary violence against local inhabitants that aim to ensure the smooth running of their illegal business rather than protecting local neighborhood inhabitants. And this kind of transformation raises issues regarding the long-term viability and more broadly, what is the ideal institutional vehicle for governance? Now, the answer to that question could obviously be related to the nature and scale of gang governance, especially when you compare it to state governance. Perhaps it's because gangs and other non-state armed groups are often local phenomena, which means that their governance is not as encompassing as the state's is, at least in theory. But I think more importantly, what we see with gang governance is that it always carries within it, because it has this kind of limited kind of scope, to kind of cross over what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben famously termed the point of indistinction between violence and law. And I'd say this is something that has arguably been very well exposed in the context of the current pandemic. When you look a bit more closely at the responses of gangs and other armed groups to COVID-19. Now in Nicaragua, for example, the pandemic has clearly created both constraints, but also new opportunities for gangs and drug dealing. Nicaragua is notoriously one of the few countries in the world to have ignored the realities of COVID-19. The country hasn't closed its borders, hasn't imposed any form of lockdown, hasn't promoted any policy of social distancing, and until very recently actually denied that COVID-19 was anything existed in the country. Now, despite this, talking via WhatsApp with people in Barrio Luis Fernando Hernandez, a poor neighborhood in Managua, the capital city of Nicaragua, where I've been conducting longitudinal ethnographic research for the past 2 decades, it's clear that despite the lack of formal lockdown, individuals have become much more reluctant to go out. Many businesses have shut down, particularly local markets. So as Doña Yolanda, a long-time inhabitant of the neighborhood, explained, People are scared of the virus, so they don't go out. The streets are deserted and shops are closed. Now, this has had a dramatic and negative impact on economic livelihoods. Many people in Nicaragua, which is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, live hand to mouth, and this includes many street-level drug dealers, including Antonio, who told me in a WhatsApp, this country is fucked. People don't have any money, so they don't come to buy drugs anymore. So I asked Antonio, so what are you doing to try and mitigate your lack of sales? And he said he had two strategies. The first was to call his upper and middle class clients and offer them a delivery service. As he put it, that way, instead of meeting me at the market or in the barrio, they call me and I go to their houses. I put the drugs through the gate, I stand back 2 meters, they come and pick up the drugs, leave the money, which I then pick up after they've gone back 2 meters. But he's had to sell his crack and cocaine and marijuana at 20–30% discount compared to before COVID-19 crisis. And he only has a handful of such clients because he previously sold mostly to local gang members and youth in the neighborhood that he lives in, Barrio Luis Fernando Hernandez. So the other strategy he's resorted to is calling in debts. And here is where we suddenly see the way in which the crisis has perhaps kind of created new opportunities which are not quite as nice as this delivery service that he's offering. It's not unusual for drug dealers to allow clients to build up a low level of debt as a strategy to ensure their retail loyalty. When debts reach a level that dealers judge to be unsustainable, they combine refusing to sell more drugs with some mild physical violence in order to obtain a partial repayment. So this violence is really generally very low level. It only involves beating up the client eventually. If the drug dealer were to pull out a knife or a gun over a small debt, they would develop a very bad reputation and lose clientele. But COVID-19 has changed this, as Antonio explained. Now it's actually easier to call in debts. Because of the coronavirus, I can't beat people up because it would involve touching them. So now I have an excuse to just pull out a gun and stand 2 meters away and ask for my money. So it's become much more efficient. People are really scared of guns, and so they pay up straight away. In this sense, you know, kind of being shaken down by the gang or by drug dealers has become something much more kind of efficient due to COVID-19. Now in South Africa, the situation has been very different to Nicaragua. The government there responded swiftly to the pandemic. It imposed a countrywide lockdown, and there have been numerous stories reporting how the crisis has led to unprecedented truces between rival gangs, particularly in Cape Town, to facilitate anti-pandemic measures. Now, the media has really concentrated on these feel-good stories. There's been any number of reports on the BBC and The Guardian about kind of these wonderful truces, gang members coming together and kind of distributing food to old people and so on. But it hasn't been like that everywhere in Cape Town. In the informal settlement of Overcome Heights, for example, gangs have instead sought to force people to stay in the streets to ensure that local inhabitants, who constitute the largest proportion of their consumer clientele, will still seek to buy their drugs. In fact, according to Norma, a long-time resident, drug dealing has actually been flourishing in Overcome Heights as a result of the pandemic. And this is because rival gangs in the area have seized on the pandemic as a reason for consolidating what was initially a very shaky peace accord that they had recently reached after a couple of years of extreme violence. Now, had there not been the pandemic, it's pretty likely that that truce would have collapsed. But the pandemic kind of created a space, and a space of exceptionality where they could actually consolidate and kind of talk to each other, often kind of by being brought together by kind of local churches who were looking for ways to make them collaborate to help the local community face the pandemic. And it meant that they've now actually formally divided up the neighborhood into areas that they kind of control separately. And they also have collaborated in taking over another informal settlement. Now, this context of relative peace has also enabled the local gangs to develop new businesses that take advantage of COVID-19. For example, the lockdown led to local drinking dens, shebeens, and shops in Overcome Heights closing down, but the gang stepped in. So the gang now sells alcohol and cigarettes in their still open drug dens, but they do so at a premium price. So alcohol is now sold at double its price prior to the pandemics, while individual cigarettes now cost 5 rand each, so 25 euro cents, compared to an average price of around 35 rand for a whole packet of 20 previously. So seen from the vantage points of Managua and Cape Town, then, the kind of reactions of gangs and drug dealers to COVID-19 arguably emerge less as altruistic forms of gang governance and more as instrumental means for surviving or even seizing conjunctural opportunities to expand their resource base, both collectively and individually. And this is likely to be the case elsewhere, including in Brazil, for example, where gangs' grips over favelas is rarely secure due to the threat of other gangs, as well as the presence of other armed groups such as paramilitary militias and the Brazilian state. So ensuring that lockdown is respected in a favela enables a besieged gang to consolidate, insofar as a pandemic therefore offers opportunities to upset balances of power, to encroach on other groups' territories, or to take over drug markets. Now, in broader terms, what these kinds of actions might be pointing to is actually the limits of the social solidarity in times of crisis that these kind of actions by gangs and militias have been seen to kind of represent, and rather actually point to a much more dystopian template for future development, particularly if the situation were to worsen, as it currently seems to be doing in much of the global south.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. Kieran, Dennis mentioned that the impact or the activities of non-state armed groups might be more multidimensional than original impressions. So originally there has been this impression that groups have helped with the curfews and introduced some benevolent measures to help the populations. But what are your views on the broader complexity of this phenomenon? Are there also negative sides to the story?
Well, yes. I mean, there's two points that I'd like to make that kind of follow from what Dennis is saying there, and from the question you've just asked. And the first is about the need for looking below the surface, and the second is about context and the importance of being sensitive to context. And on that first point, I think what we've seen, particularly in media reporting, and we shouldn't really be surprised by that, is a lot of actions of armed groups taken at face value, or as an extrapolation of this armed group has agreed a ceasefire, you know, is no longer visible on the streets. This must mean a certain motive, maybe, you know, a positive sign of the group's behavior. And also the effects, right? I mean, to take the Cape Town example, it was widely reported across South Africa that violence had dropped, that this pacifying effect had happened. This is quite a short-term effect, and there's an assumption that this is an effect of the pandemic, and this is, you know, a positive thing. What we need to do is dig below the surface, and when you do that, you need to take into account that, first of all, the actions that non-state armed groups take, they might not be for the reasons that have been assumed or reported on, and they probably, certainly not short-term. Gangs are often very, very smart and very strategic, and so the absence of violence, the reduction of violence, the removal or the deployment of people onto streets may well have a longer game in mind. And the Cape Town incident is the kind of the widely reported truce in Cape Town is quite a useful point to focus on. I've been carrying out some similar research using WhatsApp, working with a local research group as well, the Safety Lab, speaking to gang members, community members and ex-gang members in the areas concerned, and particularly in the community of Manenberg, widely reported to have had this so-called miracle truce. As Dennis mentioned in the truce that he was talking about, that there already actually been a kind of a fragile peace agreed, and there's certainly positive effects of trying to consolidate that, and it does present possible opportunities to leverage that and to try and deepen things. But speaking to quite a senior member of one of the gangs, he made the point that actually those involved in that, they were already at peace. It wasn't a new truce as widely reported. It was mainly older members, non-active gang members. This wasn't the guys who were on the streets engaged in the day-to-day turf wars. These were almost semi-retired, if you like, gangsters. And this was a great activity for them. But when you also then spoke to the local community, a couple of community leaders stressed that they felt that this did feed into this problem of gangs using this kind of support for PR purposes. You know, It kind of forced people to go to the gangs to receive food assistance and this kind of thing. You know, why wasn't this sent through the community organizations, the existing efforts of the community? That was one point that was made. But perhaps more importantly, the truce itself didn't necessarily last very long, in as much as it ever really existed. And within a couple of days, there was a shooting in Mannenberg between two of the signatories of that truce, that widely reported truce. And perhaps most interestingly, this past week, since South Africa began an easing of its lockdown, since the weekend, there's been a lot of shooting and confrontations between the Americans and the Jesters, were two of the signatories to this truce, and others across the entire Cape Flats area of Cape Town. And this violence has been widely reported by community members, also in the local media as well, as seeming to be a case of the gangs were just waiting for the opportunity. You know, they were waiting for those lockdown restrictions to ease, for the police, for the military deployments to step back a little bit. And this does tie into a point about the strategic thinking behind agreeing ceasefires or withdrawing your members from the streets. We've seen this in many places across the world. If you think to the context of Rio de Janeiro, in where I was doing the research in Complexo de Maré, when military troops or military police would go in, the gangs would withdraw. They would hide, they would take their members off the streets, but they were playing a long game. They knew at some point those forces would leave and they would return. And often actually they were smart in using those moments to strengthen themselves and to rearm themselves. And my concern in Cape Town, and this might be something that applies more broadly, is that this seemingly pacifying moment, this peace that happened during the lockdown, was used by gangs partly to rearm, and there have been reports of that, but also to strengthen the economic base. And Dennis pointed out how local shebeens, these areas in Cape Town, have been sources of alcohol and tobacco, and how the gangs have stepped in there. And speaking to community members in Mannenberg and a couple of ex-gang members, they've confirmed that a lot of the young teenagers in the area were no longer at school because of the lockdown, the schools were closed, had now become involved in the illicit tobacco trade. I mean, actually, I was told this week that it's now cheaper to buy a hit of heroin than it is to buy cigarettes. Cigarettes will cost you more, a pack of cigarettes. A lot of these young teenagers involved in this trade are now being connected to gangs, because if you want to deal in the black market on tobacco, you have to deal straight with the gangs. So there is a concern that in lots of different ways, gangs have actually benefited and might have grown during this crisis. And now, arguably, as the lockdown is eased, we're starting to see gangs reclaiming territory or fighting over territory just as they were prior to the lockdown. So early indications suggest that, you know, very superficial reports of this is peace, or you know, look at the miracle truce between these gangs, doesn't really tell you what the gangs are thinking or what's going on below the surface. And there's a second point that I wanted to make about context, and that is we shouldn't generalize too much, obviously, and we have to be very careful, and particularly if we're talking about non-state armed groups in general here. There's a huge difference between the kind of capacity that, for example, Hezbollah will have and the kind of interest that they will have in providing healthcare, in providing security. Within Rio, there's a huge difference between whether we're talking about a trafficking group like Comando Vermelho, or we're talking about the militias and who their networks are and what their interests are. And this is also borne out by my research in Sierra Leone. It's somewhere that I've been working on for many years. And there is a nascent gang scene in Sierra Leone. And in these situations, gangs have actually often been reported to play a positive role. If we go back to the Ebola outbreak, many of the young men affiliated with the gangs were actually the ones that did the dirty work. They were carrying bodies for burial, for example, and taking those risks. During this outbreak, I've been in some of these WhatsApp groups that the gangs use. It's been interesting. They've created awareness, raising videos. They've tried to assist the community in their sanitation measures. Even within their own groups, they've been encouraging members to observe lockdown measures and castigating members who refused or were breaking the rules. So in that sense, you might see that positive element, the way that is often reported, oh, look, you know, they're stepping in where the state isn't. On the other hand, you also see in Sierra Leone how, when we talk about context being important, we shouldn't just focus on the non-state armed groups. We need to understand the way the state relates and the way wider society relates to these groups and the impact on them and their relationship with the gangs during the pandemic. In Sierra Leone, there was a riot, or supposedly an attempted prison break during the lockdown, and at least 11 people were killed, possibly more. And at the heart of that riot were two gang members. Videos were circulated around Sierra Leone of these two gangsters, and I'd interviewed them both in January as part of my research inside the prison. And they were essentially being used by the different political parties, the ruling party and the opposing party, to support counterclaims that this was either a prison break attempt by the opposition party or it was something staged by the ruling government. And the point is not about the truth of those claims, it's just the way that the gangs became central to this and have since been central to rumors about, is the government going to arrest gang members because they're being used by the opposition party? Or is the government actually mobilizing a certain gang against another one as a way to intimidate the opposition party? And this is an extension of actually what we've seen in recent years during elections of gangs being part of this political mobilization. And it is entirely possible right now that the lockdown measures that have been enforced in Sierra Leone and the general context of COVID-19 has exacerbated this politicization and might be helping to institutionalize gangs and make them essentially replacement for the other former non-state armed groups, the ex-combatants of the RUF and others who used to perform that role as political muscle. And I suppose my last point here is, as we've seen in South Africa, if we think about the role of quite a harsh state response with policing and the military deployment, in Sierra Leone as well, it's the political system and the political context which is just as important in understanding how gangs react and also how gangs are reported about. So I will finish there.
Thank you, Kieran. That is very interesting. I have a couple of points and one question to make. I will welcome and invite you all to ask questions now. You can do that by writing on the Q&A button, or you can raise your hands and I will give you a voice. But to kickstart the discussion, Kieran, I will exaggerate a little bit my position as chair to provide just one piece of information that I found very interesting from Rio. So the gangs, the difference on that point of the difference between gangs and militias and between non-state armed groups in general, the gangs have, as was widely reported, have encouraged people to stay home, have implemented curfews from certain times so that the pandemic would be controlled in the communities. This was partially because the gangs are from the communities. So their mothers, their sisters, their brothers are in the community. Whereas the militias in militia-controlled areas, I've heard from researchers on the ground that in some areas they are encouraging businesses to open because they are not from the areas, they don't have this stake in the health of the people from the area, and they need money from the extortion because they operate more with extortion than with drug dealing. So that is an example of how this governance is sometimes linked to how the types of connection between armed groups and communities vary. But if you want to react to this, feel free. But also I would like to ask you a question, again, to kickstart some discussion. The recent events in the US have made me reflect on the issue of policing. And you've mentioned, Kieran, the need to understand the role of the state as well, not only the non-state armed groups, because these things are related. So in my field research, and I'm sure in yours as well, the state often comes up and is mentioned by locals as a threat sometimes and are feared sometimes to the same extent as non-state armed groups. So how does this relationship between communities and police, especially when there is a lack of trust or brutality and militarization, how does that affect the governance of armed groups and potentially now with the pandemic? So I'll ask these questions and then I will come back to ask from the participants. Kieran, maybe you'd like to start?
Thanks. It's a good question. I in particular have focused on this aspect. If we're talking about policing, given everything that's going on at the moment in Cape Town, one of the focuses of my research over the years has been on military deployments or militarized policing as a response to gang violence. And Cape Town is no stranger to these kinds of deployments. I mean, sometimes the reporting on the pandemic is also suggesting these are new measures, you know, these are new forms of militarization. This is not, for many cases, for many informal communities, it's very much a day-to-day experience of having limited mobility and fearing police and state violence. In Cape Town, one of the problems very early on in the lockdown, within the first day, in fact, was that police and soldiers were implicated in abuses. For those contravening lockdown measures, people were publicly humiliated, for example, made to do these kind of exercises. This was circulated on social media, and then there were killings as well. You know, people are being killed by police or soldiers, and this has been investigated and reported on. The effect in communities that have already long suffered from a sense of marginalization within the state, of being ignored or of even being attacked and discriminated against by the state, was to further exacerbate that feeling, that sense of alienation. And where in Cape Town, I was speaking to communities who were like, we're struggling to feed ourselves, we are struggling to pay for electricity, and we can't, like maybe other communities within Cape Town, the wealthy communities, we can't do without work, without employment very easily, and we certainly can't social distance given the high density of the living arrangements we have. The state then violently enforcing these measures just exacerbates things. And what did it do for the gangs? It tended to push people towards reliance on the gangs, where gangs, as they always have done, and as Dennis mentions, provide forms of security, whether it's physical security. I mean, in Cape Town, gangs were protecting local businesses for a price, offering to, you know, we'll stop the looters from trashing your local business. In terms of money, in terms of food, gangs and gang leaders have always played this role. So it arguably plays into allowing gangs to play that role, but it also more generally is going to create grievances. So young people in Cape Town, as in Rio, as in many other contexts, often end up at a very young age with a sense of grievance against the state, and the gang might offer them a way to channel this anger, sometimes a desire for revenge, in more violent ways. And so I don't see many positive effects on gangs themselves and their capacity to offer governance. It seems to reinforce that dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Dennis?
Yeah, no, I would add two things to that. I mean, one thing is I think here the relationship between, say, the police and kind of local armed groups such as gangs and local communities, of course, will vary and change. I mentioned, you know, you could have, well, the police can neglect certain areas. There can be collusion between armed groups, both negative and positive, in the sense of positive, where they kind of agree that they're sharing the governance of the place, negative, where the police is trying to extract money from the armed group, for example. And then you can have conflictual kind of relationships, and these can change quite rapidly. And one of the things which was interesting, Nicaragua, there was a failed popular uprising against the Ortega Murillo regime in Nicaragua in 2018, and it's led to a significant and widespread repression led by the police, aided by paramilitaries, sometimes recruited from the ranks of gang members. But talking with somebody there in February, they actually made the comment, they said, actually, you know, we've gone from suddenly living in a context where there are lots of small gangs to having one big gang, which has kind of taken out the small gangs, but we don't know how to deal with the big gang, because the small gangs we could deal with because we knew them, we knew who they were, and so on. Now, having said that, I'm just about to contradict this, because you brought up the idea of, you know, the fact that gangs are often embedded, they have connections into communities in the way that militias didn't in Rio de Janeiro. I think it's a double-edged sword, this kind of notion of embeddedness. I mean, I think we shouldn't overstress it. I mean, after all, you know, the genocide in Rwanda was kind of people killing people whom they knew. And the kind of the relationship didn't actually stop that from happening. I think what you find is that with kind of embeddedness is that it kind of creates these entanglements which in contradiction. Sometimes communities end up becoming complicit. Sometimes it creates kind of points of friction and so on. I mean, the ways in which mothers react to gang members is very kind of very variable. I mean, it can range from mothers who kind of, for example, follow their kind of gangs, their offspring, kind of telling them, please stop kind of taking drugs, please come home, don't be in the streets and so on, to others who will actively go and stab them or kind of try and burn off tattoos and things like that. So I don't think it's a kind of we can't just say that embedded gangs are going to have a better relationship with the community than non-embedded gangs. It's kind of something quite variable.
Yes, indeed. And I would add as well, I was going to mention it, but I was afraid of speaking for too long, that another reason why the drug gangs in Rio, as opposed to the sort of vigilante militias, adopted more pro-curfew measures is because they profit, most of the profit comes from the dealing of drugs. And if there is a big case of coronavirus in that community, that will deter the drug traders from going to the community to buy the drugs. So they are concerned with losing market because of if coronavirus spreads in the community. So there's also an economic interest behind that. So I see here one question. People are a bit shy. We have quite a few participants, but people are a bit shy. So please feel free to ask your questions. I will now, Tom, our IT wizard, will unmute Klaus Whitman for you to ask your question, please. Klaus, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm Klaus Wittmann, Senior Fellow at the Aspen Institute, Germany. And I'm very pleased to be with the IISS, where I spent a happy year as research associate over 30 years ago. I thank the speakers for all the interesting information and the useful differentiation between gangs and militias. Would they perhaps give us a few more concrete examples of countries where this or the other phenomenon is prevalent? And also, I would be interested to know which connection you see between militias and PMCs, private military companies.
Thank you. Dennis or Kieran, do you have any views on that? Dennis, perhaps you can start.
I guess for the first question about countries where this kind of gang militia phenomena is prevalent, I'd say that actually, to a certain extent, they're prevalent almost everywhere in the world. It's just a question of also the degrees. I mean, gangs are actually one of a small handful of pretty universal phenomena. Every society on the planet has gangs in one shape or another. Now, they don't all do the same thing. They don't all have the same role. I mean, I live in Geneva in Switzerland. I mean, gangs are really not a huge presence. The kind of roles they play here are very different to the kind of roles they play in Nicaragua or in Brazil. I think what's most interesting to think about is, I think you have to think about gangs and militia as being on a continuum. So this relates to kind of the relationship between militia and kind of private groups. You know, you can see Minutemen groups in the US would be on the same continuum as gangs and militias, as would kind of drug dealing groups, as perhaps in some cases mercenary groups. I mean, ultimately, you can put everything on a scale where you would have the state at one end and perhaps a kind of a local street gang at the other end, and everything else fits in between. And I think the value of doing that is to see that these types of organization have roles which are kind of more generic. They are, if you think about them as providing forms of governance, or if you think about them as providing forms of economic livelihood, and you compare them to what we would consider formal legal organizations, we suddenly start seeing things are not that different. I mean, when we're talking here about the gangs in South Africa aggressively pursuing market share and new opportunities, you know, how different is that from, say, some of the actions of, I don't know, Google or Apple or Microsoft? You know, they also, it's just that here we're looking at it as being legal, and over there it's not.
Yeah, I just remember one of the senior, he was a kind of independent drug dealer, but technically part of the American gang in Cape Town. Told me the only gang he feared was the biggest gang in the neighborhood, which was the police. And he went on a very long explanation of how the police are essentially a gang. And he had a lot of very good points when you look at the practical ways they operate. Just to kind of follow on from the question about PMCs, I mean, I don't really work directly on that, but there's been some interesting developments in South Africa, and you can follow the research of Professor Guy Lam, or there's Karen Doley, who's written a book called The Enforcers. She's a brilliant reporter who's been following organized crime in South Africa. And she's shown, and Guy has written about the way that gangs have actually set up private military security companies, not necessarily military, but private security companies that provide security for businesses, nightclubs, and also provide them access to weapons. And obviously in most contexts, Rio is another example, if you pull this thread from the level of the street and you just keep pulling, you end up at a point at where the distinction between the state and organized crime disappears, or becomes very difficult to find. I mean, as Dennis says, this is on a continuum, and you can certainly put some private security companies on there when you look at their kind of connections and their political connections and their involvement in organized crime. So certainly South Africa is an interesting case to see where gangs, not necessarily called militias, but vigilante groups, for example, might have a lot of links with these groups.
Yeah, indeed. And we have another question here, but I just want to add, I've done field research in Nairobi last year, and I've interviewed a few people via WhatsApp in the past few weeks on this issue of gangs in Nairobi. And there you see the gangs around election times becoming militias. And because of the links they have with politicians that use gangs, and then they morph into gangs again, which is quite interesting. So we have one question that is, I think, methodological. So how did you establish your WhatsApp networks, assuming you used WhatsApp, with gangs, and how has been your experience in researching them? Dennis?
Okay. I have a bit of a particular experience, shall we say, about this. I've been researching gangs in Nicaragua for over 20 years now. I first went to Nicaragua in '96. And let's put it this way, the long and short of it is I ended up joining the local gang for a year. I looked quite different then, shall we say. And of course, I left the gang afterwards. You know, you retire from the gang. But of course, every time I go back, I'm a respected elder. I kind of, the new generations kind of respect me. And contact, of course, you know, so it's when I go, you can talk to people, you interview, you kind of build up these relationships over 20 years. I mean, there are gang members there who might be interviewing, or former gang members, or people who were gang members who became drug dealers and so on, whom I've been interviewing every time I go, on average every 2 years, for the past 20 years. Well, with technological evolution, of course, we've now graduated on from kind of email before to kind of WhatsApp and so on. In South Africa, I'm working with a researcher called Stefan Jensen, who's at the University of Aalborg in Denmark, who has a very similar trajectory to me in Cape Town. And it's also through that kind of long-term, longitudinal trajectory that you build up these kind of networks of trust and people who are willing to kind of engage with you, to kind of just talk to you and kind of exchange and send you photos or send you videos and so on. I will admit it's not my preferred way of doing fieldwork. I do prefer to be in situ and to actually kind of spend time there, because research is not just about interviewing people. It's also about kind of being in a place, getting a sense of it, seeing things, comparing people's discourses with their practices and so on. But in the current context, you know, it has been very interesting to have this kind of constant connection with people, which allows these kind of exchanges.
Kieran.
Yeah, my experience very similar to Dennis's, except, I mean, I didn't join a gang, not yet anyway. Never say never. But
You're from the King's Gang.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, the English kings, not the Latin kings. We in all of our research, I mean, a lot of researchers just end up in these WhatsApp groups or end up in these communications precisely because if you have any kind of relationship and you build trust, it's just a way of staying in touch. But I never really went out to use this as a research tool, but the more people were sending me videos of, hey, Kieran, this just happened, whether it was Cape Town or Sierra Leone or Brazil, it's an instant way of sharing information. And often these are things that you wouldn't want to share publicly, either for confidential reasons or because of the, the graphic nature of some of the, the shootings or whatever being shared. But it's incredibly useful as well for you then to be able to get back in touch with people and fact check things or to check if they're okay. But there are some WhatsApp groups that aren't these kind of individual one-to-one groups. They are literal gang WhatsApp groups. And the one that I ended up in Sierra Leone, for one of them anyway, in the East, kind of one of the major gangs is known as the Black or East Hood Gang. I ended up in that WhatsApp group because they asked me to judge their rap competition during the lockdown, and they had daily WhatsApp freestyle competitions. And the first day was about lockdown, and the second day was about no violence. And they were really trying on both days. The first day about lockdown ended up being about how they should go outside and attack another gang. And the second day, the no violence was also pretty much the same theme. So they really struggled to change the message. But yeah, that's how I ended up in the group. But I think through kind of being very honest about your intentions, you will find that a lot of people, even if you don't know that well, like, okay, we'll join the group, we'll share this stuff with you. People are very open and willing and not at all afraid to tell you about how the gang works and what it's up to. And it's, yeah, I much prefer to be somewhere in person. I don't think it's an ideal, certainly. It's only a one kind of dimension, a way of doing research, but it's been incredibly useful during lockdown to be able to reach people and communicate with them.
So one question I'm curious to ask you is, looking forward, the impression I have, and I think seems to be a strong possibility that there's going to be an economic downturn globally as an effect of this pandemic and the lockdown in several countries. And in low-income areas where these gangs and militias tend to be more predominant in the developing world especially, economic hardship is likely to follow, and I can imagine that governments will also be stretched fiscally in terms of budgets. Some NGOs might lose their funding. What do you think the likely effect of the pandemic in the long term will be for gangs, militias? Is it correct to assume that they will thrive because of this stronger hardships, so that will also reduce their income from illicit economies? I mean, what do you think in the medium to long term, perhaps in the case studies that you've studied, or more broadly, the impact of this lockdown will be? Who wants to start? Kieran. Sorry.
I was volunteering Dennis, but okay. I'm always very cautious about trying to forecast. It's a bit of a fool's game, to be honest. But I would say, again, it's a bit boring, but it really depends on the context we're talking about. If we take Freetown and Sierra Leone, these gangs are essentially kind of survival subsistence gangs. They've already come through as a community, a protracted civil war. Now, a long time ago, actually, it shouldn't be called a post-war context, but then it's gone through Ebola. Now they're going through COVID-19. It's not a country that is going to feel the effect in a sudden drop into poverty or survival mode, because that is already the mode that the gang members are in. And they join precisely as a way of survival and a way of coping. I don't expect it to necessarily have any deep impact on the gangs themselves or on the communities. But if I look to Cape Town, there are a few effects. There's the effect I talked about in terms of, I think, the economy changed dramatically, the illicit economy during lockdown. And with tobacco and alcohol being banned, that could lead to wealthier, better armed gangs. It could also lead to more recruitment of teenagers, as I mentioned. So you might have an entirely new generation of gangsters that perhaps you might not have had. It's very difficult to tell whether what I've seen in Mannenberg and Hanover Park applies across the country, because even between the research that Dennis and Stefan have done and the research that I've done, in different communities within Cape Town, there are different effects. But also, if we think politically, I think there has been globally right now a focus and a sudden, unfortunately, understanding from people that might not have fully realized how so many communities exist under extremely difficult forms of either securitized or militarized forms of policing. And I think certainly in South Africa and in other countries, there might be more attention to the way that instead of considering issues about public health as these are health issues and how can we assist the communities, they tend to be criminalized or they're treated as security issues. And violence is pretty much the same. It's often treated as a criminal issue and not as something to do with maybe the broader drivers of poverty and inequality. So I'm not massively optimistic, but I think that in a lot of contexts, it might spark an attempt to address and perhaps carry out certain kinds of reforms in the way that violence is responded to on a political level and a very practical level, where we're talking about policing or investment in kind of development initiatives.
Dennis.
Yeah, no, I think I want to reiterate what Kieran said, that, I think context is really important here. I don't think we can really come up with these general kind of statements about how the pandemic is going to affect gangs, militias, and so on in everywhere. I think it's going to be very much dependent on context, dependent on the type of organization we're looking at. There is a difference between the small scale survival subsistence gang compared to, say, the kind of almost cartel-like kind of gang which is involved in international drug trafficking. But I will say a couple of things though. One is that, so in Nicaragua, I mentioned how the repression, there'd been this kind of a period of 18 months of repression going on in Nicaragua. And one of the things that's led to, that has actually restructured the drugs trade, partly because the police have been trying to shake down drug dealers because in order to gain resources. I mean, the Nicaraguan government is really lacking in resources. It's kind of its foreign reserves are shot through and so on. And the way they've been doing it is increasing police fines and of all sorts, including illegal ones, such as arresting drug dealers and making them pay in order not to go to trial. And that had an impact on the drugs trade, which was much more centrally controlled. You had one big guy who would then kind of hire people to sell for him, and it's generally a him, the big guy, although some of the kind of middle level and street level are also women. But that model has transformed to a more franchise model. So there's been a kind of transfer of the risk to the street dealers, who now have to buy the drugs and then sell them and they can sell it at a profit. Now, so that's one thing. The other thing which I think is interesting when you think about these groups and the drugs trade, drugs is of course a pretty inelastic resource. I mean, in context of crisis, people still, particularly addicts, still need drugs. They can't just necessarily stop. And that's something which actually, just thinking counterintuitively, it's something which actually might make the drug trade more attractive to legal actors. And you might see in a post-COVID world, a kind of greater rapprochement, cooperation, collusion between, say, formal authorities and drug dealers as a way of trying to access resources where, in a context where, states have indebted themselves to kind of deal with the pandemic.
So if we, you have very effectively dodged my question on prospects, but if we go back in time a little bit, have you seen, do you think that the presence and the governance of gangs and militias have affected the capacity of governments to respond to the pandemic, or do you think that this is a possibility? In other words, to what extent gangs and militias impede public policies to be implemented in slums and low-income areas when, of course, governments want to do that. An example that I can think of is Rio de Janeiro with the Pacification units, in which some gangs fiercely opposed the state in some areas, then started to come back. What are your views on that?
I'll go first, Kieran. I think this. I think yes, perhaps it has affected the capacity of some places. In some places, not in others. But I think also you have to see that they justify, they allow states to do certain things. I mean, you know, Trump wouldn't be tweeting, "Send the army out, send the army out," kind of get people on the streets or whatever, if it weren't for kind of the kind of protests, which are themselves a reaction to violence. I mean, there's a sense where, or in Brazil, Bolsonaro also kind of, the presence of gangs justifies doing certain things or having a particular discourse. So I think it's more complex than just saying that, you know, gangs impede states. They also kind of permit a variety of things. And I think the interesting thing here is where I'm still trying to understand why we had this initial flurry. It's almost, as far as I can tell, it's about 90% of the media reporting about gangs and COVID-19 is, wow, they've been amazing, these gangs. We never knew they were quite so nice. And now, not that I'm saying it's necessarily a problem, but I do think that it's kind of, there must be some logic behind this. It's kind of, is it portraying things in a particular way for whose agenda and why? So I think we need to kind of understand that kind of thing as well, and not just think about them as a negative for local communities and so on.
Kieran, you have the last word. We have 2 minutes left.
Great. Yeah, I would agree with what Dennis said. I think talking about whether or not gangs, prevent or impede the response of the state certainly is the case. I mean, you could argue even that they threaten the state if you look in, Mexico, for example. However, generally speaking, it is a general comment, despite everything I've said about context, I believe that gangs are usually a response to something the state isn't doing, whether it wants to or not. And I think you can cast doubt over that. And gangs provide a service usually in that absence. And that helps them grow. It provides their recruitment base because the state is not there. And this isn't about failing or fragile states. I think this is a common discourse that is misleading. These are often strong states in the sense of having the military power or whatever to do this. And it's also often states that are in collusion with organized crime. So I said, if you follow it up, you can actually find that, sure, there might have been troops going in to carry out pacification, but you can also find people that were colluding on a local level with gangs and also at a much higher level with the drugs trade. And so it's a lot more murky when you try and draw those distinctions between the state is trying to do this and the gangs are preventing them. And there is certainly a kind of parasitic relationship sometimes in which gangs only feed off to some extent what they are permitted to do or what the state isn't doing. And I think that's important to remember. And that all ties back to deep issues about social and economic and political neglect of entire communities.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very interesting, good point to finish in because indeed the socioeconomic drivers of or fragilities that help drive this problem are certainly among the reasons why we, especially in a think tank like the ISS, study this in order to inform better public policies. And it's important to notice that this is not solely a security or a problem to be solved with force. So with that, I would like to end this webinar. Thank you very much for everybody to stick with us and listen to us. And thank you, Kieran and Dennis, for your very interesting contributions. So see you next time.
Thank you.